It was meant to be a glorious summer offensive, the final push Vladimir Putin needed to set the stage for a complete takeover of Ukraine. And once he pulled it off, Putin could ignore all of this nonsense about peace and ceasefires. He'd have what he wanted all along, and there would be nothing anybody could do about it. Only, it hasn't worked out that way. Putin's plans have collapsed around him. Ukraine killed 31,000 Russian troops during Russia's failed summer offensive, with more dying every day, and Putin is getting desperate. That's according to The Economist, which published an article on July 9 in which it provided a deep dive into the data surrounding Putin's summer offensive. It points out that there is no official tally of casualties for either side of the war yet, meaning it relied on its own daily war tracker to come up with the numbers. That tracker uses satellite data and territorial shifts to locate areas in Ukraine where the fighting has intensified. The Economist also takes into account casualty estimates from more than 200 independent researchers and Western governments, which it combines with its satellite tracking to come up with an estimate for Russia's daily death tolls. Those estimates don't make for good reading if you're Vladimir Putin. As of July 9, The Economist claims Russia has lost anywhere between 900,000 and 1.3 million of its soldiers to death, injury or capture since Putin launched his ill-fated invasion in February 2022. Of those casualties, Russia has recorded between 190,000 and 350,000 deaths. Using these numbers and breaking them down into yearly and monthly figures, The Economist came up with its estimate. Our numbers suggest roughly 31,000 Russians may have been killed in the summer offensive so far, which began in earnest on May 1st, the outlet said in its July 9 report. It's harder to get a bead on the number of Ukrainian soldiers who were killed during the same period. According to the Kyiv Independent, which reported on The Economist stats in its own July 10 article, the best estimate comes from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. The CSIS figures suggest that Ukraine has experienced around 400,000 casualties since the beginning of the Ukraine war, with anywhere between 60,000 and 100,000 of those casualties being deaths. Think about what that means for a moment. Taking the low end of that estimate, these figures find that Russia has lost half the number of troops Ukraine has lost during the entire war, during an offensive that only began in earnest on May 1st. And when checking the ratios, it becomes clear why that's such a massive problem for Putin. Russia's losses of 31,000 have occurred over a roughly 2.5-month period. That gives the summer offensive a Russian death rate of about 12,400 soldiers per month. By contrast, and assuming the CSIS figures are accurate, Ukraine's monthly death rate sits somewhere between 1,481 and 2,469 per month. Putin's summer offensive can be classified as nothing more than a massive failure. As Russia intensified its operations, it ended up losing more than 10 times the number of soldiers Ukraine is losing to death every single month. This is massive, and it suggests that Putin is nowhere near to achieving the goals for his summer offensive. As for what those goals are, it depends on the source. On June 8, The Economist reported that captured Russian soldiers had been telling Ukraine that Putin's summer offensive has been presented to them as one last push before the entire country falls. The goal, assuming this is to be believed, appears to be to break Ukraine's morale so the country crumbles under the sheer weight of Russia's offensive. The Economist also spoke to Mikhailo Kemetiuk, who serves in Ukraine's Typhoon unit, the leader of an elite group of soldiers operating Ukraine's unmanned vehicles. Kemetiuk says that the only reason Russia can keep pushing like this is that the country's commanders don't care about their soldiers. Around 80% of Russia's new recruits are dying for Putin's one last push, he says. Yet, there seems to be no end to the bottomless well from which Putin is able to draw. What's evident here is the propaganda reason for the summer offensive. By presenting the offensive as a final push into Ukraine, Putin is giving hope to his soldiers, both those already on the battlefield and those signing his military contracts believe that the war will soon be over if they can take as much of Ukraine as possible during the summer. the reality is much different. Even if those soldiers snatch up the amount of territory Putin wants, the war would continue waging for years after this summer. There is no one last push, only a continued march of Russians' cannon fodder to their inevitable deaths. On the more realistic side of the scale, the goals of Putin's summer offensive can be boiled down to his desire to take territory in three key Ukrainian areas: Sumy, Pokrovsk, and the eastern city of Kostiantynivka. That's according to the BBC, and Putin has different reasons for wanting to target each of these regions. Sumy is a target because it's a border oblast in Ukraine that, if allowed to stay under Ukraine's control, places Russian border oblasts such as Kursk at high risk. Putin has terrible memories of Ukraine's August 2024 counter-invasion into Kursk, and it took him until the end of spring 2025 to feel comfortable claiming that his forces had finally eradicated Ukraine's soldiers from the region. By taking as much territory as possible in Sumy, Putin believes he'll be able to create a buffer zone that prevents such a counter-invasion from happening again. It's sound logic. The summer offensive in Sumy is all about building a massive obstacle to place in Ukraine's way. However, this reasoning doesn't gel with the one last push narrative Putin is feeding to his soldiers. A buffer zone, though important, doesn't represent a complete and total victory in Ukraine. It's just an area that will inevitably come under constant attack if Russia can create its buffer zone. Russia has already failed in Sumy, which will be covered later in the video. Next up is Pokrovsk, one of the most important strategic hubs in eastern Ukraine. Pokrovsk has been on Putin's radar for over 2 years. That's how long he's been trying to capture the city, which had a pre-war population of around 60,000 people, most of whom have evacuated. Pokrovsk is vital for a couple of reasons. For Ukraine, it's a logistical hub through which it runs troops and equipment that move on to other regions of Donetsk that the country is trying to defend. For Putin, snatching Pokrovsk means removing that logistical lifeline. It also means he takes control of a city that places him within about 12 miles of Donetsk's administrative border. Take the border and you take Donetsk, and just like that, one of Putin's main territorial goals would be achieved. The BBC reports that the Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, believes Putin has amassed a fighting force of around 110,000 troops near Pokrovsk this summer. However, those troops aren't launching one massive concerted assault. That would be too obvious. Ukraine would detect large column of troops and armor, meaning it could devastate them with drones and artillery. Instead, Russia's forces are attacking in what the BBC dubs a creeping offensive, in which it sends large volumes of smaller units to assault Ukraine's positions one after the other. It's a human wave strategy that is resulting in massive casualties for Russia. Also, Putin can draw closer to a city that he really needs. And then there's Kostiantynivka. Strategically, this settlement isn't quite as important as Pokrovsk or the wider Sumy Oblast. Still, Putin wants to claim it because it would help him to complete the Cauldron strategy he's trying to use to take Pokrovsk. The concept is simple. The Cauldron is a sort of semicircle surrounding Pokrovsk that allows Russia to attack from multiple fronts. With this multi-front attack, Russia can divide Ukraine's troops, relying on its human waves to break those defenders down until they break through. Once the breakthrough happens, Russia's soldiers can stream into Pokrovsk and create new fronts. Eventually, Ukraine's defenses would be destroyed. Taking Kostiantynivka will make that strategy a whole lot easier. But as seen elsewhere in Russia's summer offensive, what Putin wants and what he's getting are two very different things. His goals aren't being achieved. Instead, 31,000 of his troops now lie dead on the Ukrainian battlefield. And there are two reasons why. The first is that the summer offensive represents Russia's fastest attempted advance for over 2 years. The Economist points that out in its July 9 article, noting that Russia has combined more intensive ground assaults with stronger missile and drone strikes against Ukraine's key cities. On July 9 alone, Russia launched 700 drones at Ukraine, most of them targeting the city of Lutsk, which borders Poland. UKRA News backs this up, noting that Russia's losses showcase just how many soldiers Putin is dedicating to this attempted advance. The 31,000 Russians who died are more than the number of deaths Russia experienced in its successful fights for both Bakhmut and Avdiivka, the outlet says. More deaths can only mean that Putin is dedicating more soldiers to his summer offensive than he did for those two battles, which still stand as the most important achievements of Russia's army beyond the territory it snatched up during the first weeks of Putin's invasion. Putin's problem is that his military looks very different from how it did 2 years ago. His summer offensive is being conducted at a time when Russia's military is struggling with equipment problems and an army that's packed with inexperienced soldiers. Russia has lost between 10,000 and 20,000 of its armored vehicles, says the National Security Journal. Both issues are having a massive impact on the summer offensive. Less armor means Putin's forces are more exposed to Ukraine's drones, artillery and gunfire. Death on a scale not seen in the past offensives is the only logical outcome. The sheer rate of casualties Russia has experienced over the last 3+ years also plays a role. Many of Putin's more experienced and talented operators are dead or languishing in hospitals. He's replaced them with contract soldiers and conscripts, many of whom have zero military experience before they head to the front lines and only go through a couple of weeks of training before they go. Those soldiers are being sent to fight against battle-hardened Ukrainian forces, and their lack of experience is clearly showing. Many of Russia's dead were little more than warm bodies Putin sent to the slaughter. He had no other choice given his lack of more talented soldiers and Russia's equipment woes. Speaking of Ukraine, the scale and strength of the defense it's put up against Putin's summer offensive can't be discounted. The Economist points this out, saying that Ukraine has put up a mighty defense against Russia. In Sumy, that defense has practically stalled out Russia's forces. That's according to the Telegraph, which points out that May saw Russia manage to advance into Ukraine at a pace of 5.5 square miles per day, more than double the speed it achieved in April. But those steady gains were the best that Russia's forces could manage. By June, it was obvious that Russia had no real capability to push on from there and achieve any big victories this summer. The Institute for the Study of Wars Angelica Evans said as much to the Telegraph on June 29, stating, "The capacity to start something new and distinct really isn't there for the Russians right now. The summer offensive is just going to be the continuation of what they've been doing in spring." Russia's manpower advantage amounts to nothing much, with the previously mentioned inexperience of its troops playing a role in helping Ukraine stall out Putin's advances. Towards late June, Sersky said that the Sumy advance in particular was going nowhere. The Russian advance in the Sumy border zone has been stopped as of this week and the front line has been stabilized, Ukraine's army chief reported. That's not how it was supposed to go for Putin. Sumy was supposed to collapse, giving him his buffer zone along with more leverage he could use if he were forced into peace negotiations in the future. Instead, Russia's forces have run into a brick wall. That becomes even clearer when looking into the amount of territory it's claimed during its summer offensive. Mentioned earlier was that this offensive began in earnest on May 1st. Conveniently, Russia Matters publishes weekly report cards covering Russia's confirmed progress, or lack thereof, in Ukraine. One of those report cards comes from April 30, at which point the outlet says Russia held around 44,002 square miles of Ukraine when taking parts of the Donbass and Crimea Russia claimed before February 2022 into account. Fast forward to the July 9 report card and the number is 44,481 square miles, which accounts for roughly 19% of Ukraine. The summer offensive is one last push when more than 80% of Ukraine's territory is unclaimed, Putin. That doesn't seem likely. So, since the start of the summer offensive up until July 9, Russia has managed to claim 479 square miles of Ukraine. That means it's losing a little over 64 of its soldiers for every square mile it gains. But more worryingly, this territorial gain is minuscule, given that Putin has dedicated 110,000 troops to Pokrovsk alone, with around 50,000 for Sumy. So, Putin has 31,000 dead soldiers, many more who are injured or captured, and very little territory to show for his dreaded summer offensive. So, what comes next? For starters, the failure of the summer offensive raises obvious manpower questions for Russia, which is bleeding troops at a rate not seen since the last half of 2024. Putin claims he has all of that well in hand. If you listen to Russia's president, his country is recruiting anywhere between 10,000 and 15,000 more soldiers than Ukraine every single month, says The Economist. Toward the end of May, Putin himself put the number at between 50,000 and 60,000 total per month. Why would he worry about 31,000 dead? A month's worth of recruitment will solve that problem. Except it won't. On May 30, the new Voice of Ukraine reported on a study that found that Russia's recruitment figures may be puffed up. The figure announced by Putin, 1,800 new contract soldiers per day by summer 2025, may be nearly twice the real number, the study said. Add to that the inexperience of these new soldiers and the poor training they undergo, and it becomes clear that Putin's backup plan, now his summer offensive, has failed. He's not going to change his strategy. He can't. He doesn't have the tactical aptitude for that. But what he can do is send more warm bodies into Ukraine to bolster his numbers. It doesn't matter that these soldiers can't fight, because they can still absorb ammunition. It all counts to whittling away at Ukraine's defensives, though it's not going to do much when it comes to making the advances Putin wants to see this summer. Putin is desperate for those soldiers to prop up his summer offensive. So desperate that he's once again calling on North Korea. After the 10,000 or so troops North Korea sent to Russia toward the end of 2024 helped Putin to push Ukraine out of Kursk, Russia's president is hoping they'll be able to do the same for his summer offensive. On July 3rd, the Japan Times reported that Ukrainian intelligence officials believe that North Korea is preparing to send another 30,000 troops into Russia. It's unclear whether those troops will head into Ukraine or stay in Russia. Either way, they strengthen the summer offensive. Staying in Russia means they free up Russian soldiers who could be sent to the front line. Being sent into Ukraine itself means the North Koreans offer a more direct offensive force. Of course, Putin will just ignore the fact that he's putting himself deeper into North Korea's pocket with this move than he'd already placed himself. As for Russia's advances, they aren't really going anywhere even with all of these extra soldiers. The Economist puts its spin on Russia's dire territorial capture rate during the summer offensive. The current offensive still works out at just 15 square kilometers per day, roughly the size of Los Angeles airport. Over the past year, it's gained just 0.038 square kilometers, about 9 acres per dead soldier. Even at the quicker pace of the past 30 days, it would take another 89 years to conquer all of Ukraine, the outlet says. 89 years? Sorry, but it has to be said again. One last push? Really, Putin? That's what you're telling your soldiers when you know that decades of fighting await if Russia is going to fully claim Ukraine. The ridiculousness of Putin's propaganda has truly come to light this summer, and the final thing he has to worry about is that Ukraine is set to grow stronger. That didn't seem to be the case earlier in July when the US paused military aid to Ukraine amidst concerns over America's missile stockpiles. That pause has been lifted, meaning Ukraine is once again going to receive key missiles that will help it defend itself against Russia. More may be coming thanks to a deal that US President Donald Trump claims to have struck with NATO. On July 10, CNN reported on comments Trump made to NBC suggesting that the US has made a new deal with NATO that will see the US send weapons to Ukraine for which other NATO members pay. We're sending weapons to NATO and NATO is paying for those weapons 100%, Trump said. We're going to be sending Patriots to NATO and then NATO will distribute that. This was backed by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who said on July 10,
"There are other Patriot batteries, and there are other opportunities. Countries that have ordered Patriot batteries that are about to receive shipments of them. It'd be great if one of them volunteered to defer that shipment and send it to Ukraine instead."
The point here is that the US seems to be actively looking for ways to bolster Ukraine's defenses, and it's working alongside NATO to do it. Both are gut punches to Putin's summer offensive. He thought the US military aid pause meant good things for his military's future, and he certainly believed that he managed to drive a wedge between the US and NATO. Now, Putin looks to the future with less certainty. The odds are he's going to face a resurgent Ukraine as his summer offensive crumbles around him. The season that was meant to lead to Russia's victory is now nothing more than a damp squib. 31,000 dead Russians and counting is all the proof needed to see that. And while all of this is happening, Putin also has to deal with Europe's leaders announcing sweeping financial changes that will see billions more dollars of weapons being pumped into their arsenals and potentially Ukraine's. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of Putin's faltering summer offensive.